Morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us for February's Ideas series. My name is Nicholas Glesby, the NAADSN's Network Administrator. The North American and Arctic Defense and Security Network is a MINDS collaborative network addressing three core policy challenges: defense in the Arctic, securing North America and enhancing continental defense, and climate change and the environment. NAADSN engages key academic experts and stakeholders across Canada, North America, and the circumpolar Arctic to produce timely research and advice to the defense team, and to foster the next generation of scholars and practitioners. And today we are exploring the topic of balloons, NORAD, and the defense of North America, a reflection 1 year on from the incidents of February 2023. And we have a large panel of 6 people today. Everyone will have approximately 5 minutes for opening comments before turning the floor over to the audience for questions and answers. And first we have Dr. Andrea Charron, NAADSN co-lead and Director of the Center for Defense and Security Studies, and Professor in Political Studies at the University of Manitoba. And Dr. James Fergusson, NAADSN Fellow, Senior Scholar for Defense and Security Studies and University of Manitoba, who will discuss NORAD's role. Next, we will have Dr. Whitney Lackenbauer, NAADSN's Lead in Canada Research Chair, Tier 1 in the Study of the Canadian North at Trent University, and Master Corporal John Mitchell of the Dawson City Canadian Rangers Patrol Group. And they will discuss local perspectives. And then third, we will have Dr. Marc Lanteigne, NAADSN Coordinator and Associate Professor of Political Science at UIT, the Arctic University of Norway, and myself, who will compare and contrast Chinese and Canadian media reactions. So saying all of that, I'll turn the floor over to Dr. Charron. The floor is yours.
Great, thanks very much, and thanks for the invitation. So each of the speakers, we've just been given a couple of minutes to give some sort of opening thoughts and remind people of the events. I've chosen this map from CBC Kids. I like it because it puts all of sort of the events in one map and provides some dates. So my bottom line up front is that the North American Aerospace Defense Command Agreement, my national agreement, did exactly what it should do in this case of several air-breathing threats. We have the ability of US and Canadian assets are allowed to cross over into each other's territory, except for that there are very clear rules about if an air object has to be engaged, ultimately defeated, i.e. shot down. If it's happening in Canadian jurisdiction, the National Command Authority vested in the Prime Minister must give permission. If it's in the United States, it's the Secretary of Defense, and they must give permission. After that, whose assets actually do the business of defeating is really a matter of geography, how quickly they can get there, the capabilities they have. So what I thought I would do is simply raise sort of 3 questions that I am fully anticipating that NORAD and the various regional commands are discussing and reviewing. But I think they're important ones because at the end of the day, while there's a lot of talk about NORAD modernization that sort of focuses on new technology, especially the over-the-horizon radar systems that are coming online, I think some of the questions are still around command and control. And command and control is one of those very unsexy topics that requires you to go deep, deep into the weeds to look at how Canada and the US are organized, the various authorities, how they do air tasking orders, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it's one you're going to see the command pay more attention to. So one of my first questions, and no doubt this is being considered, is that in the case of the Chinese air object, and I think we need to shy away from referring to it as a balloon suggests it's quite innocuous, but we know in this case that the Chinese air object had considerable surveillance capabilities. It traveled over the Pacific to come to North America. My first question would be how many allies and even other US combatant commands, especially Indo-PACOM, actually saw this air object, knew the direction of travel, and either didn't think or didn't know to inform NORAD, being as that's their bread and butter, to warn and defeat air objects approaching North America. Related though, I think maybe we also need to look at within Canada and the United States, how blind we still are, especially if air objects are particularly high, or if they're within North America, or they're traveling quite slowly. We're still really challenged to pick up those air objects. My next question would be, what happens when air objects are at a certain altitude? In NORAD, we talk about aerospace, and Jim Fergusson is really the expert on this, but we have air and space, and we have this ill-defined territory of aerospace. I want to know, what are the command authorities when we're talking about air objects at a particular space? They probably do differ between Canada and the US, but is NORAD able to manage those differences and exercise them? And finally, is there a plan in the future to deal with objects, the last three objects, which you see as number 2, 3, and 4 on the map? They were, by all accounts, hobbyist balloons, and you'll hear more about them from other speakers, but they didn't pose a threat. And I should preference that at no time was there a threat to commercial air traffic by any of these air objects, but particularly the last three hobbyist balloons didn't seem to be necessarily tracking information would be a concern. But in all cases, they were defeated by missiles, and missiles are quite an expensive option, not to mention the costs of scrambling fighter jets, et cetera, et cetera. So in the future, and of course, this is with the benefit of hindsight, knowing that they weren't a threat. But if we have these sort of benign objects, are there other things we should be doing, such as improving education around responsibilities of hobbyists and citizens if they are going to launch drones or balloons? And now that we have cube satellites, which are very, very small satellites that can be launched now for relatively little money, the aerospace, and space are going to become more congested. And so what is going to be the plan going forward with these sorts of air objects? And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Charron. Turn over to Dr. Fergusson now.
Thanks very much. I'm going to be very brief. I think I'm hoping to be under 5 minutes, but rarely do I ever make timelines. But you can cut me off. I'm going to take a bit of different tack, and I agree a lot with what Andrea said. But the tack I want to take is to begin with a simple question. What balloons? The balloons have now been assigned to the dustbin of history. They're forgotten. And I don't, at least in the public domain, they are forgotten. I don't think they're forgotten in NORAD in particular. But otherwise, it's almost as if today it never happened. The key point, and I know Mark and Nick are going to talk particularly about the media, but it's not surprising with the media, because the media, as I like to call it, has ADHD. It's a momentary event that generates interest and then falls away and disappears. Notwithstanding the important points Andrea raised about what they should be paying attention to. One of the key questions that sort of has always been my mind about this is the extent to which, given that we hear this a lot in Canada, particularly from the military, and my focus is on Canada, and certainly you hear this in NORAD, the desire to raise the profile, to educate Canadian citizens in particular about the important role that NORAD played. Did they exploit this opportunity? The answer, in my view, is not really, or if they did, the extent they did, they didn't do it very well. And I can understand that. This was a failure. This was an embarrassment, but to both countries, the way it was presented, the American president in particular saying this was an American operation, the Canadian government not being very forceful in making it clear that this was a NORAD operation, and NORAD itself not really working to exploit this. I sort of come from a perspective that all news, even if it's bad news, is good news to raise the profile. We don't know, we haven't heard a breath of a word, and I can understand a lot of this is classified, but this is an event that could have been and should have been exploited much more fully. We know very little about the specifics and understand on classified grounds about exactly what capabilities the Chinese balloon had. The other three have simply dropped off the radar. It's never been clear. They were hunting for them in the Yukon. What happened, we don't know. What steps NORAD has taken, which is important to get into the public domain. As Andrea points out, these are high altitude, low and slow. What has the organization done? How have they responded away from the high-tech issues which dominate their attention? So these are concerns for me in terms of trying to get more and more on the public agenda, if not in the minds of both governments, of the important role that NORAD plays. And as I said, I can understand failure and embarrassment makes them want it to go away. But nonetheless, I think it was not very well done by particularly NORAD, which could have used this much better. So I'll leave my comments there.
All right, thanks, Dr. Fergusson. And Dr. Lackenbauer, do you want to go next, or Master Corporal Mitchell?
Yeah, so Mitch, please feel free to jump in if you want to segue. Otherwise, I'll try to keep my comments quite brief as well. So I'm going to focus very specifically on the Yukon incident, and especially what played out on the ground. So a lot of the focus is on the NORAD side. I mean, of course, with Andrea and Jim, we've got the two experts, you know, outside of the military itself on those themes, but bring it down to earth, if you will, and focusing on the role that the CAF played. So technically, the search and what might have been a recovery operation for the debris from the balloon. And in the case of Yukon, Andrea, I will say it definitely was a balloon. It was primarily probably small, probably no more than 6 pounds, might have cost somewhere between $60 to $180 if it was the North Illinois Balloon, you know, Hobby Club who sent it up, as a lot of the speculation suggests, but then trying to understand what the effort looked like. And while it was RCMP and therefore Public Safety Canada who played the official role of leading the recovery efforts, the practical effects on the ground were really delivered by the Canadian Armed Forces. So a series of air assets, fixed and rotary wings, so helicopters and airplanes, in an RCAF Air Task Force operating out of Whitehorse. And then numbers that came out through parliamentary committees saying about 180 Canadian Armed Forces Land Force and Special Forces personnel who went up to the region and then operated. And John, Mitch, you might give us some insight into some of the encounters or experiences on the ground. What I'm going to do is take my couple of minutes and just share a couple of stories that I've heard on the ground in general terms and some of the issues I think that have come out of this. I learned in Whitehorse that people in that community knew that the military arrived in large numbers when they said Tinder lit up like a Christmas tree. So first thing is probably some operational security lessons to be learned there as well, in terms of not signaling that you're arriving through things like hookup websites. Certainly have heard about the value of the Whitehorse Cadet Training Center in accommodating the forces who flew up and effectively took over the camp. And I bring this up because of the occasional discussions over the years of whether DND should divest this property. And I think it's a good example of why it's valuable to even have a modest footprint all across the country. I have heard how different actors within the Canadian Armed Forces pushed in and almost pushed out other subject matter experts. I won't get into details, but I think there's room for serious analysis and reflection on how information is shared within the Canadian Armed Forces, as well as thinking about friction over who should be taking the lead on coordinating within the CAF or coordinating with key partners. And CBC North, in some of its reporting, intimated that the RCAF or RCMP, pardon me, and the CAF butted heads. I don't have any in-depth knowledge on this, but from a whole of government standpoint, I think there was certainly room for improvement. What I do know is that there was also limited communication with Northerners, including the Canadian Rangers, to make them aware that something was going on. And in the case of the Rangers, to signify that they might be called upon to assist. Several people told me they learned that something strange was going on just because they couldn't fly out because the airspace around Dawson was understandably shut down. So a precautionary measure in this case. Local Rangers called out to 1st Canadian Ranger Patrol Group headquarters in Yellowknife to get more information. As Jim was saying, like, understandably, secrecy meant not a lot could be passed along. It was fortunate that there was a Ranger instructor in the Yukon supporting the Rangers on exercise NAADSN. So the annual Ranger training activities support the Yukon Quest. And he coordinated a response team with the local Rangers in Dawson in particular. And it's also really telling, the Rangers quickly identified that CAF personnel, even if they weren't in uniform, were showing up into town. So a real reminder that the Rangers are valuable assets because they are eyes and ears and they know what's going on in their communities. And arguably it was the Rangers who had the most knowledge of what was happening on the ground. And they provided a lot of essential help in arranging for things like accommodations, helping to identify places on a map. They expressed to me, and Mitch, not putting words in your mouth here, but your colleagues talking about the professionalism and intelligence of those Southern personnel who came up in this case, but simply wish they had more notification so they could have been prepared with more advanced warning to head out in their capacity as guides and enablers. So I think there's room here to think about how information can be more proactively shared with the Rangers without jeopardizing operational security. And this same sort of sentiment flows from various stories about the lack of proactive engagement with Yukon First Nations. We could talk a little bit about land claim agreements and provisions for the Canadian Armed Forces to be able to respond to emergencies without seeking permissions. That in essence, the free, prior, informed consent is baked in to land claim agreements, but that we can't lose sight of the centrality of relationships. And I get the sense that there was a lot of confusion within DND and the CAF about who should be reaching out to First Nations, who they should be reaching out to specifically as individuals, and particularly those peoples on whose lands they were going to be operating, rather than having them rely on their local and territorial sources to get a sense of who was flooding into their homelands. And some of this reached the media as well, so I'm not telling any tales out of school here. On a positive note, I also heard how the Southern-based CAF elements that deployed quickly learned that they had a lot to learn and quickly came to very highly value and respect Canadian Ranger knowledge. And it was an epiphany I heard from some of the Southern personnel operating around Dawson to understand just how much the Rangers could help them get to a location quickly. I'll also leave it on the note that precisely because the balloon was shot down far away from population centers to minimize risk to civilians, it eventually made it very, very difficult to actually mount a recovery operation, and particularly with pico balloons, if that's indeed what it was, being very, very small, the likelihood of having much debris in a sort of condensed area is very, very, very limited. Never mind, you have an object falling from maybe 38,000 feet down to earth in a snowy area. It's going to be really, really difficult to recover. So the decision was made by the RCMP, by public safety, to call off the recovery effort at that time. And that was, Mitch, you can speak to how that went, but listening to Rangers and others on the ground, because it did not appear to represent a foreign threat that would warrant risk to life and limb, but at the same time, a really creative way of seizing the opportunity space with those elements from down south who are up in the area to work with Rangers, including Mitch, to use this as a training opportunity and to build relationships where I think there's a lot of interest on all sides to see these enhanced going forward. So Mitch, I hope I didn't cover too much ground there. I know you're getting into much more detail and tell the story a lot better than I do, but I hope I didn't make any egregious errors there.
You're not too bad there, Whitney. So can you hear me okay? Okay, so I want to reaffirm this disclaimer that I'm not on duty, so I don't pretend to represent the Canadian Forces or the Rangers. So I think looking at it from a local perspective, both a little bit from the Rangers and from the community, I think there was an underestimation from the people we dealt with on the regional considerations. And of course, the obvious ones, of course, up here, everybody thinks, say, were the weather, terrain, the access and stuff like that. But there's also, I think, a tendency to paint the whole Arctic north of 60 as one homogeneous color of white paint, and it's not, okay? Not all of us have pet polar bears or pet seals or whatever. And it varies not only north to south, east to west, but also a lot seasonally. So that changes the whole dynamics of operations from boats and canoes to skidoos to ATVs and on foot sort of deal. So I think that was something that they really got to watch. The limitations, of course, up here are across the board, the community size and the services, the infrastructures and the resources that are available, and also the access into the different territories are all different. Okay. And again, that changes seasonally. Okay, so the ops, like having this happen up here, have definite impacts on the municipal level, obviously, but also on the territorial level. Like case in point, like Whitney said, we were looking at an OTAR and didn't know what was happening. In addition to that, you have all the rental vehicles, or a lot of them in Whitehorse, being blocked off, and a lot of hotels, of course, right in the middle of 3 or 4 conferences going on. So it's across the board. On the smaller communities, it's definitely going to change. It can't help to change the dynamic of the communities, like especially in the winter months. And there's a lot of like local knowledge, not just on the land for the Rangers, but also within the community. Okay. You may want to keep cutting down on the number of Air Force people you brought, because you could probably count the number of McDonald's on one hand. And similarly, the RCMP better bring their own donuts or let us know to start baking. Okay, we don't have those amenities. We don't have 24-hour gas stations, and we don't have a lot of places for accommodations or housing sort of deal. So I think, to get back to what Whitney said, like the use of the Rangers in this is not just limited to operations on the land. They're the fixers in the community that know where everything is, or how to get a gas station open, and so on and so forth. So they also, on the land, they offer the obvious. We got all weather capability for the most part, and a knowledge of the land and of operational skills on the land. And I won't use survival. I hate that word. We don't survive in the bush. We live in the bush. And there's a whole difference. If you want to be cold, wet, and miserable, join the Army. Okay. And that information is available directly through Ranger headquarters in the community capture sheets. And I think that's the first place you should be calling if you want to head up here, rather than coming up here and being amazed at all the red sweatshirts that came out of the woodwork when half of the people didn't know who or what we were. And again, my last little operational shot here, I think the Rangers need to be used a little bit different in stuff like that. As I explained to the OC there, that consider us a toll. Okay, you fire, you correct en route, and we follow up with more. Okay, it's not like the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, where we line up everybody in ranks and get everything just cute and all together. Okay, we can't afford to burn daylight out here, and we can't afford to waste operational windows. Okay, so in reality, the response from the local patrol was pretty darn good. We're looking at less than 4 hours to get an op team prepared and good to go out into an area of operation 200 miles from Dawson. with additional personnel standing up behind them to move in with the Army. So that's what we can do. And again, remember that white brush. It's not the same all the way across the north, both in the land and in the Ranger patrols. So I'll leave it go at that, Whitney.
Great, thank you for that. I'm going to turn the floor over now to Dr. Lanteigne for a different perspective on Chinese media commentary.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. It's been interesting, and because we're coming up on the 1-year anniversary, looking at the Chinese media, predictably, there have been some kind of commentaries 1 year on about how the United States and North America in general interpreted the main balloon incident. So the original response from the Chinese media was, first of all, the discussion that this was a spy balloon was completely a fabrication of the American government, that as the foreign ministry insisted on multiple occasions, this was a weather balloon that regrettably, due to force majeure, due to westerlies, was blown considerably off course, and that the United States heavily overreacted by shooting it down, which some Chinese media referred to as a very provocative act. So the Chinese media went into quite a bit of overdrive, like looking at some of the major journals, so People's Daily, Xinhua, and especially the Global Times, which is basically China's version of Fox News. You certainly see a narrative being created that, first of all, this was a regrettable accident, that the balloon, as it was called, simply went off course and the United States overplayed it, trying to score political points, trying to play up what they saw as a China threat. More to the point, looking at Chinese media stories, it also demonstrated that the American and Canadian military were, for all intents and purposes, trigger happy, that they overreacted to the situation. So among the other points that were made in the Chinese media was that the United States was exercising double standards. China made very unsubstantiated claims that several American balloons had gone over China throughout the past year, like a year previous. This was never confirmed, that the United States was seeking to provoke an incident in order to play up the idea of the China threat. So you saw political cartoons in the Chinese media of the American military running away from a balloon. And my personal favorite quote, and I'm still trying to figure out how to get this into a paper, is that the United States demonstrated a, quote, bossy demeanor. So, and there was also the idea that the United States was seeking to deflect from its own strategic shortcomings, the own problems that it had within its military forces, and also trying to deflect from an incident which took place at around the same time, the Ohio train derailment. So there was just basically a flood of attempts at deflection across the board. So although the Chinese media really tried to kind of stick to that particular viewpoint, there is also, like afterwards, there was also quite a bit of discussion about, okay, how can the United States and China mend the situation, with the idea that it was the United States that started it. So completely flipping the narrative on its head. So there were calls in the Chinese media for Canada and the United States to behave in a calm and rational fashion, that North America should practice, and this is a quote, strategic prudence, and that both countries needed to understand the big picture, another quote, that the complexity of especially China-US relations is such that, you know, this one incident should not be allowed to derail already difficult diplomatic ties. So it really demonstrated that we're getting to the point now in the Chinese media that even incidents like this can certainly contribute not only to issues relating to diplomatic relations, but also to play into the narrative that it is actually the United States, it is actually NATO that is acting as a provocateur in the international system, and that is China that is the status quo country. And the balloon incident was only the latest at the time of a series of incidents where that narrative was brought forward. So I'll leave it here. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Dr. Lanteigne. And now I'm going to put on my other hat as a presenter. I'm just going to share my screen here real quick. All right, so I know we've talked about objects versus balloons, but I'm going to refer to the balloon as the first high altitude object, and then objects as the three other ones. So I conducted a data scrape using the parameters NORAD and balloons and NORAD and objects between January 28th, 2023 and January 30th, 2024. And I found approximately 250 Canadian articles across most of the main dailies, Globe and Mail, National Post, Toronto Star, etc. I also took note that there were no Canadian national defense news releases during this time. And I based my analysis off of 3 keywords: binationalism, risk, and modernization. I was not only interested in how these incidents were communicated to the public, but also how NORAD and its role was communicated by decision makers and by the press. I think this is a generational moment for NORAD, being in the public spotlighted discourse for the first time since really September 11th, but with some misinformation and accusations in a complex international security environment. And that's something our adversaries continuously and actively attempt to exploit. So my findings: the first keyword, binationalism, was actually mentioned 17 times over 250 articles, which I thought was surprisingly high. However, it was only explained as doing things together over North America, which the Prime Minister mentioned. Binationalism, as we know, involves closer levels of defense integration than bilateralism, and is Canada and the US working together equally and with parity. And the seamless movement of personnel and aircraft across Canada and the US, where they're treated as national force assets, was first outlined all the way back in 1953 in PJBD Recommendation 53.1. And NORAD is rarely referred to as binational by editors, but rather by some decision makers, the Secretary of Defense in the US, the Minister of National Defense in Canada, our Minister of Justice, and by scholars. Dr. Charron, your name came up constantly. Joint was referred to more often, but that can mean different things in a military and civilian context. And joint was used 89 times to binationalism's 17. And it's used in phrases such as Joint US-Canadian Air Surveillance and Defense Organization. And I think it might be the reason why there is some misinformation about the movement of aircraft and personnel across the border. If binational was a more understood term rather than joint, I think it's likely that some of the confusion and discord over how NORAD works would be lessened. So the second term, risk, was mentioned 68 times and was used to describe 3 distinct threats. The first was by decision makers as the rationale for both A, not shooting down the balloon over land, and B, for shooting the next 3 objects down. These concerns were based off risk for civilian life and ground infrastructure, at least portrayed in the media, and civilian airline traffic, as the balloon was flying above 60,000 feet and the objects were in that 20 to 40,000 foot range. And the second distinction was that risk was used to describe the general geopolitical situation and North America's vulnerabilities, trying to increase, but not really dig into, the understanding that Canada is not a fireproof house. And as Dr. Fergusson mentioned, this incident happened less than a year after Russia's full invasion of Ukraine, further highlighting that, at least for a short time, it was kind of in the public conscious. And the third was that politicians and officials routinely described the balloon and objects as not an imminent risk, in what was surely an effort to calm speculation of the balloon collecting intelligence or carrying a kinetic payload that, at least in social media, that I could see, was evident. Some American reports that I didn't include in this data scrape from April and December 2023 state that the balloon was able to transmit imagery and send signals intelligence back to Beijing, but the Pentagon has denied these reports, and General Van Herk, the previous NORAD commander, said that the US was able to censor signals and protect sensitive sites during its flight. And due diligence and assertion in a complex security environment must be grounded in evidence and fact as to not provoke unintended reactions. And the third keyword, modernization, was mentioned 56 times across the 250 articles. It was used by experts, officials, practitioners, and interviewers to reinforce the importance of the outlined joint commitments by both governments over 20 years from NORAD. Decision makers highlighted this as a need for continued investment in modernizing NORAD's early warning system, which I do worry might become a domestic political issue in the short-term future. And Van Herk stated that the gaps in coverage from the North warning system left him with a domain awareness gap that is presupposed by both technological shortcomings and the lack of information sharing, given that another US combatant command knew of the balloon but did not share that information with NORAD or Northern Command.